briefly as we interact in this seminar, and I look forward to sharing my research with you all and hearing any comments you have. So this will be getting into the weeds of tax invariance, and it's co-authored with former colleagues of mine at the University of Oregon, Ben Hansen and Keaton Miller, and my PhD student, Kendall Houghton, who will be at the US Census Bureau starting this fall. I will do my very best to sort of state anything and clarify anything that's sort of United States specific. But this is both sort of United States specific and also, as we'll see in a minute, sort of recreational cannabis industry specific. So do feel free to ask any clarifying questions about these issues or any other issues as we go. So this paper is going to be all about tax invariance, and so I want to sort of lead off with that. Tax invariance is the idea that who remits taxes does not influence who ultimately bears the tax burden. We often teach this in an intermediate micro setting by sort of drawing, demand and supply curves and saying, oh, look, it doesn't matter whether you put the tax on the demand side or the supply side, the after-tax prices will remain the same. As we sort of map that into our setting, we could say, well, look, if you had a revenue neutral tax reform and we take away a tax on manufacturers and then simultaneously increase the tax further down the supply chain on retailers, what would we expect? Well, we would expect that manufacturers sort of get this big tax savings and they take that tax savings and pass that along to retail firms in the form of lower prices. And then retail firms are sort of fully compensated for the additional taxes that they're now expected to pay. And so they're not going to change the prices they charge consumers. So in the end, we have manufacturers, retailers, and consumers all being sort of just as well off after the reform as they were before. However, there is, while this sort of is a canonical notion and it permeates everything we do in terms of talking about optimal tax systems, there is beginning to be more and more evidence that tax invariance does not hold in specific settings. The first 3 papers in this list are really all about that it won't hold if there's asymmetric tax evasion. So if one side of the market can evade and then we put the tax on the other side of the market that can't, that will obviously break down invariance and affect things in that way. And then the second 3 papers are really all about price rigidities. If prices are not sort of able to adjust in response to the reform, that obviously is going to make it difficult for invariance to hold because that requires these adjustments. And then the last 2 papers are about tax salience and not about tax invariance specifically, but certainly you can imagine asymmetric tax salience also affecting invariance. So imagine if I was taxing manufacturers and they were very aware of the tax, and then I started taxing consumers and they were paying no attention to the tax. This would, sort of violate tax invariance because the consumers, presumably by not paying attention, would also then not respond in the way that we would need to have them respond for tax invariance to be preserved. However, while we sort of understand that there's sort of these specific settings where it may not hold, we still sort of treat this as, in the absence of specific concerns, as still a principle guiding tax policy. And so this paper is really asking the question of, stepping away from some of these specific settings with these specific concerns, are we going to see tax invariance hold or not? And so that's really what this paper hopes to be about. Turns out, at least in my view, that the Washington state recreational cannabis industry in the US provides a great opportunity to ask this question, to look at tax invariance in this general way. There was a really nice natural experiment via a tax reform. We had a roughly revenue neutral change, and I'll say a little bit more about what I mean by roughly a little bit later on, from we had this roughly revenue neutral change from a 25% gross receipts tax, meaning a tax on revenue with you're not allowed to deduct your costs at each transfer in the supply chain. And that was sort of the way it was when this industry opened. And then it was switched to a single 37% excise tax at retail. So we're sort of taking this tax away from manufacturer and increasing the tax at retail. It was plausibly unanticipated. It was passed last minute in a special session. It was signed the day before it took effect, and empirically, it appears to be very unanticipated. But then it also appears, and we'll talk more about this as the talk goes on, that that the response happens. The response we do see happens quite quickly. In addition, we have really great data. So we have comprehensive administrative data on the entire closed supply chain. So because marijuana is federally illegal in the United States, recreational marijuana, it can't cross state boundaries. And so this is sort of a closed market in the state of Washington. And we actually have traceability data that Washington State collected that traces out every plant from seed to final sale over a couple of years. And then in addition, both, we're looking at basically two sets of firms, manufacturers and retailers. And they're both highly aware of this tax reform, presumably, and certainly anecdotally, this is the case. And they have clear incentives to get this right. These are long-term relationships with enormous consequences for their profit at the end of the day. Both sides of the market also in this setting have limited opportunities for tax evasion because of the traceability system that's been set up, and also heavy auditing that goes with that in this particular industry. And prices in this market, I think there's evidence, and I'll present some of this as we go on, are really not that rigid. And so, it's going to be hard to blame price stickiness for a failure of tax invariance if we see that. So, broadly, we have this nice natural experiment. We have really good data, and we can sort of rule out a lot of the specific concerns that have been brought to light in the literature previously. So as we go through this talk, I'm going to start by giving a bit of background on the Washington recreational cannabis market. I will then talk a little bit about the data, give a few summary statistics. I won't talk about the theory in the paper in this talk, but I will sort of talk about our theoretical predictions. Then I'll talk about the methods that we're going to use to identify sort of the price shifts in this market in response to the reform. And then we'll actually go and look at the manufacturer data and see whether tax invariance is preserved. And I guess as a spoiler, we'll find that it's not. And then we'll look at how retail firms respond to that. And then finally, we'll sort of discuss and conclude. So in terms of a timeline, Washington was one of the first two states in the US to vote to legalize recreational marijuana. And they did this in November of 2012. And a year later, the Department of Justice, this is a federally illegal substance. So the Department of Justice had to decide what were they going to do about states legalizing a federally illegal substance. And so they released a Cole memo, which basically said, look, we're going to effectively turn a blind eye to what you're doing, states. However, we're only going to do that if you keep it out of other states and keep it out of criminal enterprise. And so most states, including Washington, responded to this by creating a traceability system. So basically tracing every plant from seed to final sale, collecting all the data on, weight transactions, on plantings, on all of this stuff, on the prices, and THC content and so on. So they had detailed information about, sort of the whole supply chain. which then would allow them to, have an enforcement arm to go and be sure that, marijuana wasn't leaving the state or going into criminal enterprise or these other sorts of things. And also something to point to the Department of Justice to say, hey, look, we're really actually trying to abide by your request. Then in July of 2014, the market finally opened. The recreational cannabis market finally opened. And a year later, once things were sort of generally settled down and prices were generally stable, we had this tax reform that was implemented. Washington's cannabis supply chain sort of by legislation has 3 links that have to exist, and a given firm sort of can't do things that aren't in the purview of their license. So if you have a cultivator license, you can plant, either seeds or clone material and grow the cannabis. And then you harvest about 4 months later, and then you're going to separate the plant into flowers or other material and dry it. Then you're going to transfer it onto a manufacturer, and they actually take the flowers and cure them and transform them into usable cannabis, which is what we're going to be studying here, and also other products like edibles and concentrates. Large parent lots are then sort of subdivided into small packages. So in Washington state, you would get a vacuum sealed package of your marijuana. And you could get a 1 gram, 2 grams, 3.5 grams, 7 grams, 14 grams, an ounce, and so on. So what always happens is that you would have, let's say, a bunch of, Blue Dream, which is a very common strain of cannabis, and you would have a bunch of 1 gram packages of this Blue Dream that came from a particular parent lot, and you would then sell that as a specific inventory lot to retailers for retail sale. Processing takes about 6 weeks, and then the retailers, all they do is, they have this cannabis they purchased from manufacturers and they sell it to consumers. So you would believe from this that there's really going to be 3 links that we're thinking about as we talk about invariance. But in fact, Washington state allowed cultivators and manufacturers to be vertically integrated pre and post reform, meaning that you could a single firm could hold both a cultivator and a manufacturer license, and sort of, if they had both licenses, do both sets of processes. And if you were vertically integrated, you didn't have to pay the 25% tax as you transferred from sort of the cultivator arm of your business to the manufacturer arm. But if you were a cultivator who sold to a different manufacturer, you definitely did have to pay a 25% tax. So you can imagine no one really wanted to do that. And so 95% of the industry was vertically integrated pre-reform. An interesting question to think about, how does vertical integration and production change in response to the reform? And we looked at that in another related paper as we try to understand really some of the consequences of having gross receipts taxes, which have been sort of a topic of conversation that's come back, worldwide and in the United States as well. But here we're really focused on tax invariance. And so because 95% of cultivators and manufacturers are vertically integrated, effectively there's a tax on manufacturers when they transfer to retailers, and then effectively there's a tax at retailers when they transfer to consumers. And so that's really the part of the supply chain we'll be looking at here today. There are other licensing restrictions that are worth mentioning. I said, manufacturers and cultivators are allowed to be vertically integrated. Manufacturers and retailers are not allowed to be vertically integrated. And that's either directly, but also through family connections. I can't own a retail firm and my brother owns a manufacturer. In addition, the applicants for these licenses had to pass background checks and undergo a lengthy application and zoning process. A physical location and funding had to be secured in advance of applying for the license. So this is, actually a lot of, you had to have lots of dollars to just sort of achieve this, and you had to be pretty savvy. And so, if what you had in the back of your mind up to this point was a bunch of potheads opening some firms to sell some marijuana, or the black market, which was thriving in Washington before this reform, entering and starting to sell legally. That would be wrong. Almost no black market growers or sellers were able to acquire these licenses because of these and other requirements. So instead, we can talk a lot about whether that's fair or not, but that was sort of the way it happened in Washington. And so instead, the fairly savvy set of owners on average, obviously with some variation, many of them have had previous business experience, and so on. So I think that's helpful background for thinking about how to interpret these results. Cultivators were limited in the size of the plant canopy that they were allowed, which means, because 95% of cultivators and manufacturers are vertically integrated, this effectively means that manufacturers are also sort of constrained because they're only really as big as their cultivator arm was before the reform, for almost all of them. And so, there's these three different sizes, and the largest size is still pretty small. 10 to 30,000 square feet of canopy is about 2/3 of an acre, which at least in the United States is, sort of small time farming. So these are all relatively small businesses. We shouldn't think of there being like a big tobacco of cannabis here. So I think that setting is useful. Also on the retailer side, at the time of the reform, they were only allowed 3 locations. So there also can't be sort of like, the monopoly or oligopoly world of, a few retailers selling to the whole state. Whoops. So now let me sort of talk a little bit about the data. Like I said, the data is coming from Washington's traceability system. So it's basically a seed to sale system. We're going to get the linked data on price and weight of each sale as it goes from manufacturers to retailers, and then again from retailers to consumers. And that's really what we're going to be focused on here, specifically the prices. Manufacturer sales we have sort of individual day transaction level data. We're going to aggregate up to the week. We could do the day and we get the same estimates. We have to control for day of the week fixed effects, and you just really don't gain anything from that. And so we're going to aggregate to the week level, and then we're going to aggregate up from the transaction level to sort of where we want to be for our identification empirically. So on the manufacturing side, we're going to be aggregating up to retail location, manufacturer location, strain week, meaning we're effectively, you think about this sort of like a regressionist continuity in time, we're effectively going to be taking a manufacturer, let's say selling Blue Dream to a given retailer, and say, okay, we're selling Blue Dream for $10. Well, this would be more like $5 a gram pre-reform. Then, after this reform, does it stay at $5? Does it switch to $4 or so on, right? And so that's really what we're effectively going to be asking. On the retail side, we can look at that, look at this at that aggregated level. We can also disaggregate more, right? So they have specific inventory lots. So a bunch of 1 gram Blue Dream from a specific manufacturer that was all grown under the same conditions. And they're going to sell that, day in and day out. And we can look at, how those prices shift after the reform relative to before. So for this sort of fixed products. We have to clean the price data a little bit on the retail side. The retail prices were supposed to be reported tax inclusive before the reform, and then they decided they should be reported tax exclusive after the reform. But firms obviously aren't perfect at their reporting. Did tax inclusive mean also include the sales tax or not? Things like this, did they switch right away or a month late? And so we can sort of use an algorithm to back this out, because this is still a primarily cash business, and is universally basically every price is all round all tax inclusive. And then we do a little bit of other very minor data cleaning. Okay, so let me give a few summary statistics. The retail tax inclusive price pre-reform is about $13 a gram. Tax exclusive price is about $9.57. The manufacturer price is about $4.10, so there's a big markup here. There's a substantial probability that retailers and manufacturers are going to increase or decrease their prices in any given week. Again, sort of highlighting this isn't, a super rigid market in terms of prices. And we will, going forward, I'll show a full histogram of prices on the manufacturing side, which will also give you an even better sense of things. And the tax revenue pre-reform was about $4.50 a gram. And it would have stayed basically identical post-reform if if retail prices had, tax exclusive prices had stayed fixed. But obviously, if you think tax invariance holds, they're going to have to fall to keep the tax inclusive price constant. And so in that world, we might expect tax revenue to fall by a bit. And so I'll talk a little bit about the degree to which that influences some of our benchmarks here in just a minute. In terms of competition on the retail side, this is a really concentrated industry. The market share of a given retailer within a 10-mile radius is about 31% on average. On the manufacturer side, manufacturers could sell and did sell all across Washington state. And so it's hard to put a radius around that. So the average firm, had a statewide market share of about 1.4%. The biggest firm had a statewide market share of about 2.9%. But there still is a fair amount of, retail manufacturer concentration in the sense that 75% of what a given retailer is going to sell on average comes from about 7 manufacturers. So these relationships are really important. We certainly think we live in a world of imperfect competition, and on the theoretical side, we certainly would allow for that. So what does some of the theory that we consider in the paper sort of predict for empirical predictions is really what I want to talk about on this slide, as well as be very explicit about the exact nature of what was happening pre and post reform with these taxes. So pre-reform manufacturers were required to remit a 25% tax, and then they were required to remit no taxes post-reform. And they would remit that tax on the price. They'd sell something to a retailer and then remit a 25% tax on that sale, right? So in log points, this is a 28.7% decline in the price they're going to receive after taxes. Should say a 28.7% increase in the price they receive after taxes, sort of post-reform, right? So if we think about perfect competition, we would always expect that they're going to pass along that entire 28.7% of tax savings on to retailers after the reform. It actually doesn't matter whether the tax change is revenue neutral or not. This is just always what they will do. Even when we sort of step into imperfect competition, in the paper we use Whale and Fabinger's model, which is sort of a paper written all about incidence, allowing for competition to go all the way from perfect competition to monopoly with a conduct parameter. We can show there, as we sort of modify it for our setting, and allow sort of 2 stages of in this supply chain, that again, regardless of the nature of competition, we expect that full 28.7% to be passed on to retailers in the form of lower prices. That doesn't encompass every type of market that you can imagine. For example, you can imagine a model of bargaining or other things. So we can also make basically a weaker assumption, just that costs are passed through monotonically. In this case, I think it's helpful to think about it in sort of a bargaining world. If you had a revenue neutral reform, and so, the same amount of tax revenue is being submitted, then you have sort of the same surplus. And so you're going to have to pass along all 28.7% onto retailers. With the slight decrease in tax revenue that we expect under tax invariance, you could, at the very extreme, imagine manufacturers are able to capture all of that extra surplus, and then they pass on the rest to retailers to keep retail after-tax profits and their tax-inclusive prices constant. And because of the slight decrease in tax revenue that was actually predicted by tax invariance, instead of 28.7%, this would be 17.7%. So we have sort of these two benchmarks on the manufacturer side. At the very least, taxes, prices need to fall by 17.7%, up to that sort of full pass through of these tax savings of 28.7%. On the retailer side, retailers remitted a 25% tax pre-reform and a 37% tax post-reform. The tax was required to be included in the posted price, so consumers are fully aware of the tax, either directly, they know what the tax is, or indirectly in the form that, if the tax rate goes up, the price might change, and they're aware of that price change. The tax was on the sales tax inclusive price pre-reform and the sales tax exclusive price post-reform, so that affects our calculations a little bit. But the predicted decline in the tax exclusive price, which would then keep the tax inclusive price constant, is about 7%. And with imperfect competition in sort of a whale and fat meter setup, you would actually expect retail firms to instead of keeping their tax inclusive prices constant, to actually cut them a little bit. So we see, more than a 7% drop in the tax exclusive price post-reform. So those are sort of our theoretical predictions, and now we're going to sort of take those to the data empirically. Our estimating equation, we're going to sort of take this regression discontinuity in time, but put it into first differences. And so we can think, which will make some really nice event studies that we'll see later. So we can sort of think of it as there's some sort of average change in prices in any given period. And we're going to ask how different was that price change in the week of the reform, basically. Manufacturers don't sell every strain to every retailer every week. That's a little bit too frequent. And so we're going to do two things about this. One, we could just, only have 1 week differences. And when they don't sell every week, we just drop that data and we'd get very similar estimates, but we just don't have a ton of power there. Alternatively, we can take very different lengths. We take a 1 week difference if that's available, otherwise a 2, 3, or 4 week difference, and then control for these difference length fixed effects. Or we can just aggregate up a little bit further to monthly differences. Both are, I think, reasonable approaches. Both are going to give very similar answers, as I'll show in a minute. And we're going to cluster our standard errors by retail and manufacturer location. So let's start by looking at sort of the manufacturing results to see whether tax invariance is preserved. So we would need manufacturers to cut their prices by at least 17.7% to preserve tax invariance. And in fact, what we see is only about a 7% decline. This is statistically significant at the 0.1% level from 17.7%. And obviously it's statistically significant from 28.7% as well. It's about a third of what we would need. And in column 2, we're thinking about it in cents. So you need about a 64-cent decline in prices to preserve tax invariance. And instead we see about a third of that, about a 22-cent decline. We could conduct the same regressions a year later as a placebo, and we'd see that these estimates are basically 0. You might also say, well, Caroline, there's many more options for doing placebos, and that's really what we do here. So imagine you have every week, and except for the weeks right around the reform or right around 4/20, which is a major cannabis holiday with lots of price cuts, or Black Friday, which is another US day where there's lots of sales, and marijuana has sort of piggybacked on that. If you sort of drop those dates, then we can look and see, what's a typical price change we would estimate if we put the reform in any of these other weeks. And we see that these estimates are centered around 0, and we never see an estimate that's as big as, the 7.2% decline that we see in response to the reform. So it's already way bigger than anything else we'd see in any other week, but yet way smaller than what we would predict for tax invariance. If you want to do like a worst case scenario, you could sort of assume, well, what if in the absence of the reform in that week, instead of estimating, one of these zeros, we actually had a pretty positively biased estimate. The most positively biased estimate we ever observe at like 0.03 or 0.04. How would that affect the estimates? Well, even then, they're going to be well shy of invariance, because you take like negative 0.07 and add on negative 0.03 or negative 0.04, and that's only about 11%, which is still well shy of 17.7%. So even under that sort of worst case scenario in terms of bias, we still don't expect tax invariance to find that tax invariance would hold. Whoops. Our baseline bandwidth is 6 weeks on either side of the reform, but what bandwidth we choose really doesn't matter. We can do an event study with very different lengths. We're not going to omit T-1 because it's not a mutually exclusive category. And T is, in this sense, these very different lengths, it's basically the first week post-reform that these manufacturers are going to sell to a given retailer or a given strain. And we see all of the response really concentrated in that first week. And then really, there's no sort of pre-trend in the data, and there's really no response in these additional weeks after the reform. We could also look at this at a monthly level. We sort of aggregate to the month. We can't really look pre-reform because those months are affected by 420, which again, like I said, is a major holiday with a lot of price changes. But here we have our omitted category of T-1, and then we can see a very similar response in period T if we are aggregated at the month level, and then just no response in these periods after the reform. If we did this 1 year later as a placebo, we see the estimates are all basically 0. And lastly, on the manufacturing side, we can look at a histogram of prices, and the shaded gray region are the 6 weeks pre and post reform that don't include the reform. And we can see sort of a full distribution of price increases and price decreases. This is retail manufacturer strain pairs, and so we can see these pairs span the gamut, and there's about 30% who don't change by much, but then there's lots of price increases and price decreases. And these two gray dashed lines that aren't at 0 are at negative 17.7% and negative 28%. And what you can see in the gray histogram is that there is a reasonably sizable distribution of prices in any given week that's going to be that big or larger. These aren't huge, even though they're large percentages. They're not huge dollar amounts, they're 50, 60 cents. And so still sort of a reasonably common type of price shift to observe. And then in the period of the reform, what you can see is sort of this, with this sort of hollowed out histogram with a green outline. So you can see that there's sort of this shift left in these prices. It's much less common to not change your price. And there's a much larger distribution of price changes that are decreases. And this, this goes all the way down to sort of this full negative 28.7%. And then there's really no significant shifting thereafter. So this really highlights two things. One is, it's very unlikely if you had some sort of other secular shift in that week that it would have this pattern of sort of shifting all the way down to this full pass through of these tax savings to retailers, and no further. And also, it highlights the fact that while on average we aren't finding tax invariance, it's certainly the case that some retail manufacturer strain pairs are having these big changes in our sort of tax rates. It's just not that common. So tax invariance fails, we can ask then how retail firms respond to that. So if tax invariance had held, we would be expecting retail firms to cut their tax exclusive prices by about 7% to keep their tax inclusive prices constant. Instead, what they do is cut their prices by about 4.5%, which then translates into about a 2.5% increase in the tax exclusive price, and that isn't shown here, but is also statistically significant at the 0.1% level. So retailers are worse off, but they're also passing along part of this to consumers. And so consumers are also worse off. In column 3, we pursue sort of a different identification strategy that's really going to tee up what we do in column 4. We're going to, instead of looking at given inventory lots that were purchased pre-reform under pre-reform prices, we're going to aggregate up to the manufacturer retail strain pair. We're going to say, well, this retailer bought from this manufacturer some Blue Dream pre-reform, and then they bought some, then they started selling it. And then post-reform, they bought some more Blue Dream and started selling it again. How does that price change, post-reform relative to pre-reform? And we see that that's almost the same. And then in column 4, we're able to control for the change in the log wholesale price, which then is, pre-reform relative to post-reform change in this period of the reform. And we see that that change in the period of the reform fully explains the actual change that we observe in the tax reform, which suggests that retail firms are basically following a constant markup rule, which is profit maximizing for them. So one way of sort of interpreting this is sort of tax invariance fails. Manufacturers keep lots of this windfall, and then retail firms sort of respond to that in a profit maximizing way as they set prices for consumers. The placebo estimates are all really near zero. The permutation test, I think it makes most sense to do that on the tax inclusive price, and you can see that these estimates are all really close to zero in periods that are not the reform, and much smaller than anything we see in the period of the reform. Bandwidth really doesn't matter. And then again, we get back to this defense study, and we again really see that the entire response is in the wake of this reform, and there's really no longer run response. So with my remaining couple of minutes, let me just sort of discuss and conclude, and then I look forward to any comments and questions that you all have. Tax invariance doesn't hold. I feel like I just summarized this, so maybe I won't say much about this slide again. But our work sort of relates to this larger literature on asymmetric responses in default. There's a new paper in the Journal of Political Economy by Benzardi and co-authors that finds that VAT changes have asymmetric pass-through. Tax increases are passed through at twice the rate to consumers as tax decreases, and we basically see that manifesting itself, but actually between two sets of firms. So when the manufacturer experiences a tax decrease, they hold on to, even though they're selling to another set of firms who should be paying lots of attention, they hold on to a lot of that tax savings. But then retail firms, as they go to interact with consumers, go ahead and increase their prices in a profit maximizing way in response. And our results are really consistent with anchoring and loss aversion. Sort of anchored to the prices pre-reform, and that's where negotiation starts. And that's really how it pans out here. And these are really general principles that would always be around for any kind of reform that's revenue neutral. And I think sort of then leads us to think a little bit about what the implications of this study are for tax system design. Typically, we think that if we impose a revenue neutral tax reform to sort of change how our tax system is set up, it won't. there won't be any redistributive consequences. But in fact, we see here clear winners and losers. Manufacturers are worse off, retailers and consumers are better off. And so, assuming you didn't want those redistributive effects, maybe you did, but potentially that wasn't part of your plan. And so now there's, more risk to beginning with the wrong tax system. You're going to sort of incur these redistributive effects if you have to change the system later. And in fact, this is kind of what happened in the Washington cannabis industry. In the United States, all recreational cannabis, in pretty much every state, it's been legalized by ballot initiative, meaning that you actually sort of write down, we're going to legalize cannabis and we're going to have this tax system and so on. And then voters actually vote whether or not they want to they vote yes or no at the ballot box. And so there's a particular person who's behind many of the ballot initiatives in the United States. And his primary goal is to legalize marijuana. He's not that worried about what the tax system looks like. And so he runs a lot of focus groups. And in Washington state, it turned out that a 25% gross receipts tax was very popular among voters, particularly sets of voters that he felt we needed to win over if recreational cannabis was going to become legal. And so we had, that was the tax system that was then in place at the beginning. And then in Washington, you're not allowed to change any part of a ballot initiative for 2 years. And so they sort of were stuck opening the market with this tax system that they didn't think was really optimal and then changing it later. And, if we don't have invariances, there's more potential costs to doing so. And then secondly, when we initially design a tax system, we may want to actually consider taxing potentially, sort of breaks my tax heart, but it's possible that you'd want to tax, at more stages along the supply chain. There's obviously trade-offs here. There's clear costs that we're well aware of, but if there could also be benefits depending on the equity and efficiency considerations that we have. If it's no longer the case that when I tax a retailer, they're going to pass part of it back along to pass a specific part of it back along to manufacturers that we sort of understand would hold in the case of tax invariance. And certainly, going back to the cannabis industry, there's been a big taste for taxing at multiple points in the supply chain. So then, I think we can start to ask and start to think about, to what extent is that optimal versus to what extent is this sort of playing on, consumers, misunderstanding of how taxes work. And so I think that's, interesting here and interesting, I think, for this conversation going forward. So with that, I'll conclude. Thank you so much for listening to this talk and joining me today, and I'm happy to open it up and answer any questions that you all have. So thank you so much.